Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be back in Warsaw. This is my third or fourth visit to your city, and it's always too short, but I'm determined to make the most of it with all of you. Now, ever since Magda invited me to this conference, I've been thinking about whether design is emotional. In music, a minor key, at least in Western cultures, connotes sadness, right? Does design have any comparable intrinsic emotional properties? Maybe scale? Scale produces awe if you're in a Gothic cathedral, or fear if you're on a diving board 3 stories over the water. Can we recognize emotions in color? I think not. It's too subjective. I don't buy the studies that says red is agitating or that pink is calming. Just think of the Barbie frenzy, and you have to rethink pink. Texture is equally dependent on personal associations and environmental conditions. A fuzzy blanket can be comfortable or irritating, depending on your attachment to fuzziness, or a lot, or no attachment to fuzziness. I began to wonder if emotions were something that designers, maybe more properly, marketers, layered onto objects. The thought occurred to me when I was stuck in traffic behind this truck. Does this truck tremor? If that's the case, I'd be worried about driving it. Or is it me who is supposed to tremor? Was this dull gray vehicle trying to be sexy? As I waited for the light to change, I could feel my cynical side rearing up and then backing down when I started laughing at the disconnect between the truck and its name. Rather than focus on emotional manipulation, a manipulation that characterizes so much of the way design is sold, I decided to curb my skepticism and dig more deeply into the emotional potential of disconnection, both deliberate and accidental. I'd already been thinking a lot about design's ambitions and how the dynamics involved in achieving them have consistently played out over time. I distilled it down to what I see as 4 essential approaches that we bring to shaping our spaces, objects, and systems. Namely the desire to make things uniform, to make them perform, to co-form them, or to deform things. Of the 4, I've always found deforming to be the most compelling because it's a way of testing what we take for granted, a test that we will gladly take if it's done with humor. You could say all design offers alternatives, right? You could say, I can have this phone or I can have that phone. Design that operates on comedy, however, has a broader existential dimension. And I should note here that my observations are based less on the scientific methods we heard about this morning and more in a an educated laywoman's philosophy. The philosopher Simon Critchley goes so far as to say that comedy brings human beings back from what they have become to what they might be. While the scientist Herbert A. Simon famously wrote that design is the act of changing existing situations into preferred ones. Both are corrective by nature. And in Laughter, an essay on the meaning of the comic, Henry Bergson points to another way we can understand the relationship between the two. Bergson sees all attempts to regulate life as latently comic. By that definition, design, which orchestrates so much of daily life, is surely ripe for comedy. But it takes tricksters to reveal it, and it requires designers to see design as latently funny. So why are we drawn to the comic? For better and worse, it appeals to our ego. Some would say intelligence. I think what speaker this morning talked about wit and intelligence. On those terms, getting the joke is a matter of one-upsmanship and runs the risk of being cruel. At the very least, however, comedy requires a bit of distance from its subject, and laughter gives us a distance on everyday life. There is a paradoxical coldness at its core. The novelist Jane Smiley recently wrote, I think a lot of things are hilariously funny, and that's kind of the way I live my life. I also believe it's only possible to live if you can detach yourself and detach your sort of sense of what's going on a little bit and take a kind of observational position on everything. Being detached is the first step to being comic. For designers, the second step is to share the joke. It requires the observation, which designers are usually pretty good at. And when the recognition of the punchline is mutual, that's when we're invited inside the joke. The comic then becomes self reinforcing. The positive feelings generated by laughter, even when the joke's on us, are feelings that we want to experience again. Now, I want to just warn you all, I wasn't very religious about differentiating between humor and comedy. I'm using them somewhat interchangeably here. So I know there's a difference, but I'm not going to draw it. These two poles of humor have been recognized and named since antiquity as Juvenalian and Horatian, named for the poets Juvenal and Horace, whose satires were respectively savage and amusing. And I find it fitting that comedic design has a relationship to poetry, albeit a distant one, as it too uses a kind of shorthand. Now, this roll of toilet paper falls somewhere between the two classical poles. It's an attempt to co-opt a mugshot that is itself a parody of fierceness. It joins the ranks of toilet humor, crude, but not quite vicious. Bottom line, it's juvenile, not juvenalian. Trump has conveniently thwarted all efforts to be as vicious as he is, and maybe it's good that we can't be. Now, besides adopting tones that run the gamut from harsh to gentle, the comedic also carries values. It is especially important that designers recognize them because, unlike stand up comics, designers aren't there when the joke is told. In other words, it's only ethical to question what we are really doing when we design for laughter. I won't belabor each of them now, but you'll see that I use them as a way of understanding the effects of funny things. And what of comedy's values? Its techniques, rather. We've just done values. What are the strategies and tactics that designers borrow from the comic repertoire? In trying to understand these operations, I've deliberately largely avoided using literary categories like parody or farce. They're sort of shorthand for things that we don't examine very closely. I'd rather articulate the underlying operations of comedic design, be it contemporary or historic, formal or informal. You'll see that I've annotated each example with its comic technique and its value. I offer it as my admittedly humorless way of trying to understand how and why we design to provoke laughter, snorts, or smiles. Bear with me, the designers are the comedians here, not me. So I want to begin with these two-tone tights, one of the mildest forms of humor. It's a project of the Milanese designer Anna Barber, and they are deliberately uncoordinated, but they never fail to amuse strangers when I wear them. Some people get quite confused. I've been asked whether I know my legs are two different colors, as though I didn't dress myself in the morning. Um, People on the street smile, but they don't see me. I become a kind of marionette with moving parts like the Commedia dell'arte figures that they invoke. It's as though two different bodies have been sewn together, not just two different colored tubes of fabric. As it happens, the tights also demonstrate another of Bergson's observations, namely that things which seem simultaneously lively and mechanical are inherently comic. It's why we laugh at silent movies. Compounding the effect they produce on the body, these stockings also play a little mind game, albeit in the form of an inside joke. Sette sette, the name of the tights, doesn't translate to 77. It translates to 7-7, which is Neapolitan slang for a woman's legs. And I won't go any farther than that. Now, in addition to being culturally bound, humor is also time bound, not just in terms of the brevity of surprise, but also in terms of changing social mores. What previous generations would have found amusing may well be censored today, like this instantiation of aristocratic voyeurism. Baroque gardens often featured seemingly innocent giochi d'acqua, water games, triggered by hidden fountains. Step on the wrong stone and you're doused with water. Now, this sounds innocent enough, but when Montaigne saw the Villa d'Este's fountains in 1581, he noted that these surprise spritzes were also designed so that gentlemen could watch ladies lift their skirts and show a little leg. In fact, he said thigh. This was the 16th century equivalent of Marilyn Monroe in the 7-Year Itch. Monroe's character chose to let the air vent on the street cool her off, or not. It was probably the direction of Billy Wilder who made her do it. To be sure, the risque provocations of Baroque fountains, and they really were risque, were not only aimed at women, though with men the approach was more scatological. Ever the equal opportunity man, Montaigne also describes a grotto with water-driven automata, where by a single movement, all the seats will squirt water all over your breech. So you sit down on that picnic table and your pants get soaked. Uh, you see the same tactic at work here in the image on the left at Salzburg's Hellbrunn Palace. And this was not an anomaly. In the early 19th century, Stendhal wrote this about the gardens of Villa Lita in Italy. Quote, as soon as I stepped onto the lowest step of a certain staircase, no fewer than 6 jets of water sprayed up between my legs. By contrast, the fountain on the right is far more demure. The Peterhof Surprise Waterworks offers a purely innocent pleasure. When you sit on the bench, water flows down from the roof, allowing you to look out at the rain even in sunlight. The umbrella cum fountain operates on a romantic notion of surprise, which now that I think about it, may have encouraged unchaperoned intimacies, so maybe not so innocent. In any case, like its Italian and German counterpart, unlike its Italian and German counterparts, it keeps you dry with your clothes on. Now, given that seating has a fundamental relation to our posteriors, it's not surprising that chairs are a through line through the trajectory of design and comedy. This particular lounge chair, Protone in Italian and lawn in English, reflects social changes of the late 60s and early 70s. Designed by Giorgio Soretti, Pietro de Rossi, and Riccardo Rosso, all key figures in the Italian radical design movement, Protone violates all rules of decorum. In the communal spirit from which it was born, it celebrates intimacy and rejects design conventions that would have us sit apart. On top of that, it's pointedly out of place. It brings grass inside, grass that's just over 3 feet tall. But the truly funny bit comes in getting in and out of it. Then Protone stages a burlesque. It makes us awkward, violating one of the cardinal rules of modernist design that the Italians were pushing against, that it will be servile and unobtrusive. Protone offers the opposite of equilibrium. And by inviting us to flop and sprawl, it's a reminder that design that becomes comic depends on the body. Design that is comic looks funny, strange, even on its own. Protone straddles both. Now, what you see here are some novelty products that are designed to disrupt the flow of everyday behaviors, from shaking hands to once again sitting down. Considered innocent and frivolous entertainments in the middle of the 20th century, hand buzzers, itching powder, and whoopee cushions operate on unbalanced power dynamics. The whoopee cushion has an especially long pedigree of humiliation, one that dates back to the year 218 CE. The historian Mary Beard tells us it first appeared in the court of a little-known Roman emperor called Elagabalus. This is the same guy who served fake food made of glass to his lesser banquet guests. Now, it's not clear he made them eat the glass food, but still, he planted the suggestion. The laughs the emperor got out of the idea of watching bodies contort themselves in pain or simply writhe in embarrassment makes itching powder seem almost inoffensive and the hand buzzer cute. There are, however, occasions when bodily distortion makes us laugh at ourselves because we're in control. And when we stare into that funhouse mirror, we can enjoy the uncanny sensation of having an out-of-body experience. Distortion and exaggeration are close allies in the comedic toolbox. Exaggeration, however, is a little bit more directed, or shall we say, pointed in this case. Here, Stefano Giovannone and Miriam Miri weren't borrowing Pinocchio's nose just to make a cute product for Alessi. They have a slightly more subversive agenda. Their funnel performs just like the naughty boy's nose when he tells a lie. Its spout grows by virtue of the liquid it funnels, kind of like the way your nose runs when you have a cold. The idea, not to mention the act of using the nose as a pouring spout, albeit a plastic nose, is kind of disgusting. I suspect a psychologist would see it as a playful way of easing our anxieties about bodily functions, and easing anxiety is one of comedy's canonical attributes. When the designer Elio Cacavalli wears a pig snout, he's jousting with forces that are not only psychological but also ethical. True story. Cacavalli met a boy named Robert Pennington who was suffering from liver failure. His doctors kept him alive by hooking him up to a series of pig livers that filtered his blood while he waited for a human donor. Pennington survived, and so did one of the pigs, which the boy kept as a pet. This led Cacavalli to speculate about a fictional or not so fictional future in which shortly after birth, people would be given a piglet with their DNA engineered into it, their own personal organ bank. It made him wonder about the kind of design objects that might be needed in this scenario, say one in which you smoked and you might get cancer. To which he designed an artificial pig snout cum air filter meant to protect your pig's lung from your secondhand smoke. After all, the pig is your spare parts, right? Can't have them getting lung cancer. Like many before him, Cacavalli makes difficult subject approachable, using the comic trope of exaggeration, in his case, of the pig's nose, and by extension, the exaggerated realities of speculative design. On the one hand, there are questionable ethics of keeping a pet to prolong the life of its human companion. On the other, there is the fact that interspecies transplants could save thousands of patients waiting for donated organs. But I think at the end of the day, Cacavalli's plastic pig snout is just a Trojan horse. The real object of fun is human stubbornness and persisting to smoke, not the innocent pig or the desperate patient. It's worth noting that the comic potential of drawing humans and animals closer, which Cacavalli does so provocatively, has a long tradition. And we see this in the drolleries that medieval monks drew in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. They upend the conceit that we're in charge with role reversals that make men, and it was always men, look helplessly foolish. Drawing these subversive scenarios, often, I think, yeah, there are only men here. There might have been a nun in there somewhere. Drawing these subversive scenarios also offered an escape from the monotony of copying. These were small gestures of freedom and comic outlets within very regimented lives. These poor men would be at their desks or whatever they were called for, from dawn till dusk, till the light went out, actually. The fantastical marginalia also gave monks a covert way to ridicule sacred and secular power while safely locked within the monastery's walls. I love the owl with the bishop's mitre on it. Now, if humor is the art of borderlines, then as we've been seeing, one of the most existentially powerful borders is between the human and animal. Aquatic animals are no exception. W.C. Fields, one of the greatest comedians of the 20th century, and also one of its most famous alcoholics, said he never drank water because of the disgusting things fish did in it. He might have appreciated these glasses by Ted Muehling, designed for Lobmeyer. When they're filled, they appear to be in their element, but otherwise, they are decidedly fish out of water. This duck is permanently grounded. Some of you may know it from Venturi, Scott Brown, and Eisenor's Learning from Las Vegas, where they theorized architecture as being ducks, buildings that are symbols, or decorated sheds, structures with ornament. Now, I show it here for a different reason. Its comedy lies in its scale. The big duck dwarfs us, but without a whiff of condescension. Nor do we feel any cynicism, even though it's basically a giant ad for eggs. At least momentarily, we get to experience a childlike experience of, going to a ride at a fun fair or something. While the Long Island duck's theoretical bona fides may not be widely known out of architectural circles, the archetypal rubber duck is pretty universal, although I use that word universal, which I heard a lot today, very cautiously. I'm sure there's parts of the world that haven't seen a rubber duck, but they're probably few and far between. Anyway, here we see its innocence blown up into giant proportions by Florentine Hoffman, who floated several of these in harbors around the world. Little did he know that his project to spread joy would inspire public protest ducks. This is where comic objects barge into the realm of politics, both secular and sacred. In 2020, rubber ducks were used often at pro-democracy demonstrations in Thailand. Here you see the protesters daring the police to shoot what are essentially children's toys, making the point that government-sanctioned aggression would be felt by innocent bodies, both rubber and flesh. In denying the police a violent opponent, the ducks had the added value of deflating their power. They made the absurdity and the disproportionality of the situation palpable. When a comic object that's as bright and recognizable as the bathtub toy is inserted into institutional domains, it exposes the contingent nature of those domains' power. Unlike a piece of satirical writing that takes time to read, design can expose the fragility of a state or organized religion instantaneously. And I suspect at least half of you, if not all of you, know what's coming next. It can appear and disappear in a flash. And this is what happened to the Poison Well installation by Jerzy Colleen at this city's National Museum. Apologies if the joke is stale here in Warsaw, but it still seems fresh to me. And being culturally Catholic myself, if not practicing, I feel entitled to tell it. For those of you who don't know the Shaggy Dog story, the Poison Well, the image in the middle, was a response to Maurizio Catalan's satirical 1999 sculpture La Nona Ora, which depicted Pope John Paul II felled by a meteor. Colleen's work was meant to bolster the power of the church and the memory of the Pope, who worked to end Polish communism. Tellingly, the Colleen has the Pope standing in a pool that's colored red having its obvious significance. The call and response set up between Catalan and Colleen invited yet another comic reproof by what else but an inflatable duck that was tossed in anonymously and quickly removed by security guards. Compounding the absurdity of having the Pope attack a toy is the fact that, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you, the Polish word for duck is also the nickname of your deputy prime minister. Not incidentally, I'm grateful to your compatriot Marcin Vicha for explaining this and helping me to see this is a joke on church and state simultaneously. Now, in the interest of being ecumenical, I show you a project that takes aim at a Judaic tradition designed by the Boym partners, who are also of the Jewish faith. Asked by the Israel Museum in Jerusalem to create portable objects for the observance of Shabbat, Constantine and Lauren played with the taboo against using tools on the Jewish faith's day of rest. They made a carrying case in the form of a handyman's toolbox, printed directions for making challah bread on a tea towel, cast candle holders and other ritual objects in the shapes of wrenches, hammers, and pipes. In doing so, they made the point that it's impossible to observe Shabbat, or for that matter, perform any or most of our daily rituals without using instruments. In other words, tools. You might even say they were making an ontological argument for design. Can't get too far in the day without touching something or being imbricated in a system of somethings. Now, one of the most comically complicated objects I've ever come across is this medieval puzzle jug. It combines the kind of cerebral humor embodied in the Boym's work with sloppy physical comedy. It skewers church and state, takes a jab at foreign relations, and makes a fool out of novice users who have to figure out where to put their fingers to avoid being drenched. You can see there, the stem, or I should say the core, the column at the center, has all kinds of holes in it. So what kind of picture is this? It's decorated with naked bishops and dancing girls. Clearly, the church is as much of the butt of the joke as the clueless user. There's also speculation that the jug contains a political joke based in the long-standing friction between France and England. Though it was found in England, hence the name Exeter puzzle jug, it was made in a part of France that was awarded to England in 1289. 1259. Speculation has it that the ewer was a French potter's that was directed at uncouth and unwelcome English invaders. So here you get a sense of how they work. The water doesn't come out the holes. It goes through the handle and out the mouth. But you have to figure out that, I mean, at least the first time you've got to figure out. So if you were really unlucky, you had to drink your mead from one of these fuddling cups. They both have 3 cups linked through their handles, and they were a really big hit at drinking games. The fact that these puzzles qualify them as a form of wit, the German one being quite sophisticated. But what really makes them funny is the behavior they induce. After your first sip, you're drooling like you're drunk, and you've only had a little sip. You've lost your stature as someone in control of his body who can hold his liquor. And you regain it by figuring out the hydraulics and trying them out on somebody who doesn't know how to use it. So the game is one of power relations, but a harmless one, because eventually everyone must have been in on it, or it wouldn't have become a thing. They'd just be one-offs. And maybe what they do is they give them to somebody after everybody knows what the joke is. You give someone a fuddling cup when they're halfway through the evening and see how they fare. So the humor in puzzling something out takes a deliberately disturbing turn with Anna Meier's hair disguiser, dinner plate, and wall tiles. This is a very different kind of puzzle. Pubic hair, actually drawings of pubic hair, are glazed onto their surfaces. And of course, your first instinct is to wipe them away, just as you would if you got a hair on your plate in a restaurant. But good luck, they're permanent. Watching someone trying to wash them away would provoke the kind of humor that's based on superior knowledge, much the same dynamic that was built into the fuddling cups. The difference here is visceral. Mere imprints white hygienic bathroom tiles with signs of sexuality that can never be washed down the drain. And how they got to the dinner table is anybody's guess. This is only a dirty joke if you think that sex is dirty. In fact, here it's quite clean. Where Meier's hair disguisers operate on a certain degree of subtlety, these warning against driving while using a phone are in your face in more ways than one. In some respects, the scale is not unusual. We expect billboards to be this big. What is unusual is that the accidents are out of place. We see cause and effect in an almost cartoon fashion. The Facebook F crunching the hood of a car suggests using social media could literally kill you. And the telephone pictogram is pretty clear. The designers, whose names I've not been able to trace, have turned conventional highway warnings into the equivalent of giant emojis, cute and to the point, and probably more meaningful than words these days. To my eye, they've co-opted a bit of Wile Coyote in these cartoon crashes, not to suggest that drivers are indestructible, but because humor draws attention. So you are likely to pay attention to this, and hopefully make you realize this is not a good idea. Now, continuing with public service announcements, we have this project by Design Investigations, a cohort at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, who are trying to address local resistance to wind turbines. I discovered it on Instagram just a couple of weeks ago. I have to really applaud Instagram. It's a good research tool. Surprisingly, the proposal is designed to ease anxieties over the aesthetic of wind turbines, which apparently some people find vile, by introducing the cozy aesthetic of garden gnomes. Here again, context is everything. My grandmother's gnome on the upper right gave me nightmares for years. It was always kidnapping my parents. So the funny side of garden gnomes is just lost on me. The proposition would only work in places where garden gnomes don't freak people out more than turbines, as far as I'm concerned. Again, the relativity of humor and emotions. My last 2 slides bring us back to the inherently comic nature of design itself, in particular, its claims to function. Here, Daniel Eacock's hybrid magnifies the function of the umbrella and the watering can by conjoining them, which sounds awfully tendentious when I say that out loud. But it's the incongruity of the two forms that are meant to carry water that makes this a funny way of connecting their operations. You don't expect to see them together. In a Heideggerian sense, we notice them because their operations are interrupted in this kind of assemblage. The hay fever headset on the right comes out of a Japanese practice called shindogo. It started in the early 90s by a man named Kenji Kawakami. He was short of products to feature in a magazine called Mail Order, so he just made some up, both as a joke and a way to fill empty column inches. This contraption might be his or one of his imitators. In any case, if you have a runny nose, this toilet paper guarantees you won't run out of tissues for a long time. It's a setup of our on-demand economy, not to mention the silliness of hats. And these two artifacts are absurdly didactic about function and at the same time profoundly funny, or better, ridiculously profound. The hand that secures the railing to the wall apes the security that the railing affords our hands. This pun made of stone not only spoofs that dependency, it also makes a sly joke about architecture itself. A hand reaching out from a wall is an uncanny reminder of what I think of as architecture's double function, which is to protect us physically and poetically. Or double responsibility might even be better than function in this case. The candle holder on the right is another witty reminder of our dependency on design. It reminds me of my colleague Clive Dilnot's frequent observation that we design because we are failed animals. We can't see in the dark, so we invent lighting. We can't carry enough candles to illuminate a church, so we build artificial arms and hands to hold them, in this case, literally. Works like these invite us to recognize design's essential artifice, its fabrication of our realities, and they do it by offering variously pleasurable, goofy, and biting alternate realities. In becoming their unwitting test subjects, whether it's being soaked by a deformed pitcher or transformed into a jester by wearing two-tone tights, we are also reminded how vulnerable we are to the designs of others. If only fleetingly, comic objects turn the tables on those forces and suggest that things might well be otherwise if we're not afraid to laugh. Dziękuję. So I don't know how I did on timing. Are we okay?
Perfect.
Okay.
Actually, we have 1 minute left. Jeżeli Państwo zdecydują się zadać
If you decide to ask a question, we have a surprise that now it's the time to ask questions. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question? This is a paradox of reality. When we have the opportunity to ask questions, there are no questions. So I understand. Okay, there is one question here. Please.
Use this opportunity to make you a question because I'm super curious. Is there any object that always make you laugh?
There might be something that always makes me laugh, but it's not guaranteed to make anybody else laugh. And I would think, I keep coming back to Constantine and Lauren's Shabbat kit. Every time I look at it, I thought, what genius? Which reinforces my point about getting the joke and feeling smart. I mean, that's a little bit snobby of me in some ways, but the fact that they turned the tables in such a gentle way, they didn't rub the rules of their faith into the ground. They just tweaked them. And you wouldn't even necessarily get it if you weren't, if you didn't read their website. You might get it. But I'd be curious after all the presentations we've had, if anybody has a problem with my contention that design isn't intrinsically funny and that it can't be. I only could find, not funny, emotional. I mean, I think scale for me could induce fear. Unless you're a professional diver, I can't think of anything worse than being made to walk off a high dive 3 stories up. But I don't think you're able to say that I mean, I don't know. I'd love someone to disagree with me. I'd love to find out that design has properties like music has properties. No? Yes?